Peta Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. Go woke, go broke, writ large for Woolies CEO Brad Banducci, with the shock announcement today that he's headed out the door. Now, the company will try and spin it. It's all part of the grand plan, they'll tell us. But it's hard not to think that recent blunders, including the fiasco over Australia Day, were not clear factors in this decision. Speculation mounts of the prospect of an early federal election this year, with a leaked Labor staff message putting it on the cards. Now, the PM saying nothing to see here, but I'll tell you what, this is the PM who says one thing and does another. I'll give you my take as from someone who's been on the inside in just a moment. Plus, a ceasefire motion from the Melbourne City Council has been voted down. Now, this is the right move, but it's just another example of local government wasting time on something only Canberra can control. And I don't know, it got to a vote, the vote went down, yes, we know that, but there were some violent protests out the front of Town Hall while the 4-hour debate progressed. And with Labor trying to hold up appearances that nothing has changed in border security, it's telling that Australia's Defence Force Chief General Angus Campbell has now headed to Indonesia to discuss the worsening situation. The PM's not saying much about the meeting, but this tells me Labor's in crisis mode, with the prospect of more boats now looking likely.
Did he seek ongoing support from Indonesia to thwart people smugglers to Australian shores, like the one that arrived last week?
Well, Indonesia plays an important role. We don't talk about the operational matters because it's important that we not give a heads up.
But first, yesterday's exclusive story from News Corp journalist Samantha Maiden about that leaked message from the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff to the office. This was the message you might recall, updating the team about the impending arrival of Labor campaign stalwart David Epstein, and it included that line which everyone has since gone troppo about as we enter the election year. Now, take it from someone who's written those sorts of emails in that very office before, I'd recommend a Bex and a lie down before anyone gets too excited. Now, the first thing is that the PM's Chief of Staff will always have his or her eye on the next election. No surprises here, particularly when I remind you that Tim Gartrell, who is Anthony Albanese's man in the job at present, also ran Labor's hugely successful Kevin 07 campaign when he was then Labor's National Campaign Director. That Gartrell is focused on what they need to do to win and amassing the personnel with the experience to achieve that should be expected. Indeed, I'd be the first to be critical of Gartrell if he wasn't. The second thing that struck me about this leaked message is how much some in the media took this as confirmation that there will be an early election and that it will be called before the end of this year. Sure, there could be an early election, but it's just as likely they'll run into next year, given the government has until May next year to hold a federal election. They're not way out in the polls, and as history has shown, Australians don't like early elections anyway, least of all from a first-term government. But the most important thing I want to impress upon you tonight, despite the fevered speculation, is that anyone who knows that Labor are about to call election or says they know Labor's election timing, well, they don't know. That's because not even the Prime Minister or the new campaign director in Gartrell's old seat, they don't even know when the campaign will be. That's right, not even the Prime Minister knows now when the next election will be. And the reason he doesn't know is because it hasn't been decided. Now, that sounds simple enough when you say it like that, but believe me, calling an election involves a huge number of moving parts that most people in the media never fully appreciate. It involves a whole lot of things that you need to fall into alignment, an enormous number of things that have to be considered, and the work on all of that's done over months, not days, such as, does polling day hit a sporting final? Are we campaigning in winter? Where are the school holidays in all of this? Are all the party pre-selections completed? How much money's in the can? Where's the legislative agenda up to? What's the likelihood of interest rate hikes or falls? And on it goes. Now, critically, and so few people even mention this one, the question of where the Electoral Commission is up to on its program of boundary redistributions. Because it's hard to have an election without the boundaries of the new seats being drawn, isn't it? Now, I come at all of this with my own personal experience, as you know, but I should also declare that my husband, Brian Loughnane, was the Liberal Party's National Campaign Director for 14 years. He ran 4 federal elections, 2 for John Howard, starting in 2004, and 2 for Tony Abbott, finishing up with Abbott's landslide win in 2013. And as he always said, you prepare day and night for the next election, and that work starts the day after the last one. But you call it, he said, and remember this, you call it when you think you can win. And that's exactly what Albanese, Gartrell and the Labor machine are doing, preparing day and night to give the PM the flexibility and firepower to call it when he thinks he can win. This year or next year, well, that's not even in contemplation yet. It's about how well they're travelling in Labor's internal polling. And as we know, this all has a long way still to play out. All right, let's go to camera now for the headlines. Sky News political reporter Olivia Casely.
Good evening. The Prime Minister has hosed down speculation about a 2024 federal election, saying he's planning on having a federal budget early next year. An election can be held any time from August, but there's a growing sense he might pull the trigger before Christmas. Anthony Albanese announcing today he'll hold the 2025 budget in March. We saw the former coalition government do the same thing in 2022 with an election held in May.
So you're going to go till May next year?
Well, I've said that 3-year terms are too short.
It follows a leaked memo from Anthony Albanese's Chief of Staff, Tim Gartrell, obtained by news.com.au. It says, quote unquote, as we enter the election year. This could be interpreted as an election being held in the next 12 months or, indeed, in 2024. Meanwhile, real wages have grown for the third quarter in a row. The latest data shows wages rose 0.9% over the December quarter and 4.2% for the year. It's also the first time wages have outpaced inflation on annual terms in almost 3 years.
We want to see real wages growth in a sustained and in a sustainable way. We're very pleased with this outcome today, but we know that there's more work to do.
Australian writer Yang Hengjun will not appeal his suspended death sentence in China. His family released a statement saying commencing an appeal would only delay the possibility of adequate and supervised medical care after 5 years of inhumane treatment and abject medical neglect. Foreign Minister Penny Wong says she respected the difficult decision and the Australian government would continue to advocate for him.
All right, big news today from the corporate world with the CEO of Woolworths, Brad Banducci, stepping down after 8 years in the top job. The move, of course, coinciding with the retailer announcing a half-year net loss of $781 million and that train wreck of an interview on the ABC Four Corners program earlier this week.
Sorry, the former head of the Competition Commission says his words are that
retired,
we have...
by the way. I shouldn't have said that, Angus. Are we going to leave it in there if we are?
Well, I mean, we're on the record. You said it. I mean, you know, let's move on. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I think I'm done, guys. You know, I do this with good intent. You know, I don't do this with bad intent. No.
You're walking out, really?
For more on this, let's bring in the man with his finger on the pulse of corporate Australia, Sky News business editor Ross Greenwood. Well, Ross, Woolies quick to point out, of course, he's retiring. They say they've been on the hunt for a new CEO for some time, but it looks pretty bad for Banducci today.
Yeah, it really does. I mean, let's be honest, he was under investigation there by Four Corners and by really the Australian Parliament as well over supermarket pricing in this country. There's a number of inquiries going on right now, not the least of being one by the ACCC, the Competition Commission. And this really goes to the heart of inflation, the cost of living that people are having to put up with. And if you consider that Banducci is the head of a company that has, something of the order of $34 billion of worth of sales in the past 6 months, has 200,000 employees. I mean, that was a pretty easy one, to be honest, to be able to get through. He knows well enough how the media works. He really shouldn't have taken that interview, the truth be known. And my sense is he knew he was on the way out. And I get a sense that a bit of frustration got the better of him there. There's no doubt about that. Brad Banducci has been a good operator for Woolworths, but the effectiveness of a good leader is their communication skills in tough times. And that is certainly a significant lapse from Banducci there when he really did address Four Corners. But go to the heart of this, probably there was already a transition to the new chief executive anyway.
He didn't help himself, though, with Australia Day. I mean, I was a supporter of Woolies. It was my favourite of the big supermarkets. I haven't walked in the door since that whole fiasco over Australia Day. Yeah, and I won't be alone there. I think a lot of Australians think like that.
That was my exact point, is I think a lot of Australians do get that. And remember, it is a very fine line as to whether you shop, with Coles or Woolworths, or whether you go to Aldi, which has been able to come into Australia and pick up, close on 20% of the market share here in Australia in a relatively short space of time, which goes to show also that shoppers are all about value. That is what they're really all about. And that's what these investigations are all about, is, people were concerned at the start of this year when, unfortunately, taking the advice of the Weather Bureau and thinking there was an El Nino effect about to arrive, dropped a whole lot of cattle and stock onto the market. Meat prices at a wholesale level collapsed, and yet there was a growing suspicion that really wasn't being passed on with any earnestness at our big supermarket chains. And that's prompted some of these inquiries, which Brad Banducci will have to go and front, and which, to be honest, he's fronted in the past. So he will leave, if you like, a clean trail for the next chief executive coming in, and that in many ways is the hallmark of an outgoing chief executive doing their job.
All right, another thing I want to talk to you about, Daniel Wild from the Institute of Public Affairs. We spoke last week. We talked about businesses fleeing from Victoria thanks to a catastrophic failure of the state's energy policies. Well, the Assistant Treasurer in Victoria says that's not true. We might have a grab there. Let's have a listen.
We're going gangbusters as an economy. I mean, if you look at it, state of the state, we're flying along. The economy's really strong, and we're the engine room of the national economy.
Well, the way I look at it, Ross, if you think Victoria's going gangbusters, you're in the wrong state, because what's really holding up the economy in Victoria is rapid and constant migration. It's not businesses coming to Victoria, it's just people literally off planes.
It's certainly not government policy that's bringing people and businesses to Victoria. And the reality is that the rate of failure of businesses in Victoria is higher than at any other part of the country. Now, this is simply not necessarily just because of energy prices, but it's also the impost that the government is placing on those businesses. It's extra payroll tax. It's new land taxes, which are going through the roof. Anybody who's picked up a land tax bill in Victoria recently just understands just how significant that is. And so as a result of this, you just even go here, new business starts. This is ABS data. This is what the IPA put out. Just goes to show the heart of where businesses are opening in Australia and where they're not wanting to open. And so, in many ways, the Victorian government has got to get its energy policy right. It's got to get its tax policy right, because do understand that the state needs those businesses to be there paying taxes, because the $170 billion worth of debt that did start out at $20 billion when Dan Andrews came to power, but over the next 5 years goes to $170 billion, is really going to be debilitating for services in that state over the next decade.
And of course, Ross, it's the national economy's second most populous state. Victoria's got to pull its weight.
It has to pull its weight, because the national economy needs the jobs in Victoria. It needs really a vibrant economy there. So what it needs is not more taxes and more, shall I say, impediments to open up a business. It needs to get rid of those impediments. It needs to allow business to thrive and prosper and to be an open economy for them. And it doesn't want disincentives, because business is walking away from Victoria right now, just as it's walking away from Queensland. BHP is one that said it will not invest another dollar in Queensland while it has its current settings. So states have to understand that they have an obligation, if they're wanting to get investment into their states and they want to create the jobs for the people who live there.
Terrific analysis as always, Ross. Thanks for your time.
Quite okay.
All right, let's check in on the rest of the headlines with our panel. Daily Telegraph national editor, of course, you know him, a Sky News Outsiders host of media on Fridays, James Morrow, and one of our senior reporters here in Sydney, Carolyn Marcus. Well, welcome to you both. Let's go back to that issue that's been burning all week, if we can, the return of those asylum seeker boats. 40 men found, of course, in outback WA last week, now in Nauru. James, we know there have been cuts to aerial surveillance. We know the Border Force budget's under pressure. We know also there's a leak in the papers today that the Minister Claire O'Neill says she's going to, thump the table and get a boost to Home Affairs in the May budget. But that'll only make up for what Labor's cut out. Today we find the Prime Minister's got no plans to reopen Christmas Island as a backup. Now, I think this is absolutely crazy not to get Christmas Island out of mothballs and send a really clear signal to the people smugglers, even if Labor doesn't believe it, that they mean business.
Yeah, but I mean, the fact of the matter is what you just said is absolutely correct, Peta. And the problem is they don't believe it. And, in politics, people can tell when you're not being sincere. That goes domestically, and it also goes for people overseas. And people overseas who look at Labor and they say, oh, they abolished TPVs, their attitude is this. Their immigration minister was an advocate for the people who were on the Tampa in 2001. So, they look at this combination of facts, they look at they're not opening Christmas Island, and they know that this is a government, Peta, that is not serious about borders because, in the leftist ideology right now, and these are all hard left types, not, sort of labor right types, they believe that borders are, somehow icky and not really good and kind of racist. And what right do we have to decide, as John Howard said, who comes here in the circumstances under which they come, which, of course, remember, offended so many people 20 years ago. And now, Peter, we're running back into the same territory again, tragically.
And what says to me, Caroline, that this is a real problem? We've got the Defence Force Chief, Angus Campbell, up in Indonesia right now talking to defence officials there. So concern in the ranks, this is cutting through, but also new survey data out today that says immigration and border security is an increasing concern for voters, including, critically, and this will impact Labor, younger voters too. So I think Labor knows, at least internally, this is hurting, even if they don't want to have any mention of it in the media, as the Prime Minister tried to avoid again today.
Yeah, they can't ignore the latest research, Peter, which clearly shows that concerns over immigration and border security have really jumped since the last survey was done by the same researchers back in October. And keep in mind that this research was done even before the latest arrival of 40 asylum seekers. So you can only imagine what the concerns will have jumped to since then. People are rightly concerned, given Labor's past record on this issue, when there were 1,200 deaths at sea and 50,000 boat arrivals after Kevin Rudd dismantled Howard's boat policy and border security policies. And Labor needs to address those very real concerns that people have.
James, you might have heard me at the top of the show. I said everyone needs to take a Bex and lie down. The job of a Chief of Staff is to light a fire under the office and say we've got to get ready for an election. But no one knows when that election will be called. I mean, the Prime Minister does not know. They haven't made the decision. As my husband, a former national campaigner, used to say, they'll call it, or we'll call it, when we think we're going to win. Now, Labor's not in that position right now, but some in the media, I tell you that the frenzy today about an election this year was extraordinary.
Well, yeah, of course it was, because, of course, there was that one little bit there in that leaked signal message about an election this year. Now, did they mean this parliamentary year? Did they mean calendar year? Who knows? It's a fascinating question, though, of course, because what you're trying to predict is when will they decide that the stars are just aligning enough? Now, it's fairly obvious to a lot of people. A lot of people are saying, well, the economic picture will start to get a bit rosier after the budget, and they want to get this locked in quickly so they can get a better chance at a longer term the second time around. But there's a contrarian view to this, which is that if the Reserve Bank doesn't wind up loosening money again, which people are talking about them not doing now after the wage price data, that there will be some advantage in holding out longer to this term and then having a good hard crack sometime early in 2025, whatever we are by then.
All right, we'll see. Let's go to Melbourne City Council and those disgraceful scenes outside Town Hall last night, Caroline, where the councils were debating a motion about a ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas war. Now, of course, it's nothing to do with local government. I don't even think the Australian government's got much of a say, but it's at least within their constitutional responsibilities. It was only defeated by a line ball vote. The acting Lord Mayor, known to us as Nicholas Rees here on Sky News, he put the casting vote to bring down the motion, so it was defeated. Outside, though, hundreds of pro-Palestinian protesters reportedly screaming shame when the decision was announced. Listen to what a Jewish woman told Melbourne Radio 3AW this morning.
And as we tried to go through the crowd to that doorway, some Palestinian supporters with a large Palestinian flag actually moved in order to bar the entrance. And the next thing you know, my husband was pushed to the ground and I got pushed and kicked from or punched from the back. And the whole thing kind of became quite an unruly scuffle.
What about Victoria Police? I mean, they were there. Did they do anything?
Yeah, they escorted my husband, myself and the other guy who was attacked out because they had to remove any triggers, i.e. anybody who was identifiably Jewish, and my husband was wearing a kippah.
So yet again, Jewish Australians who are being attacked are the ones that the police move on, not the pro-Palestinian or anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic protesters.
It's disgraceful, Peter, and I reported on the first instance of this back on October 9, 2 days after terrorists invaded Israel and slaughtered 1,200 Israelis, innocent Israelis in their home, and kidnapped over 200 of them. There were protests on the street of Sydney. There was no retaliation at that point, and it was only a Jewish man who had a still rolled up Israeli flag with him, who was arrested by police outside our own town hall here in Sydney and given a move on order. Not the violent thugs that police believed he was at threat of being physically hurt by, but the Jewish man. And then, of course, we went on to see the disgraceful scenes outside the Opera House later that same night. But in terms of the Melbourne City Council, I don't know why these local councils feel that they need to continue to grandstand on this issue that does not concern them and only provokes more division in the community, as we saw outside the town hall in Melbourne last night. I mean, Israel clearly would not care what some piddly inner city Australian council has to say about its existential war against the most barbaric genocidal terrorists. It's not go, oh, Melbourne Council told us to put down our arms. Okay, we'll do just that. I mean, there's not a lot I agree with Nicholas Rees on these airwaves on, Peter, but this is one issue he was absolutely right to step in and use his casting vote to vote down. And he wisely said that the red flags for him included that this motion did not unequivocally condemn Hamas for its role in this war. And also it tried to draw some sort of false equivalence between these innocent Israeli hostages, which include babies, and Palestinian terrorists who are serving sentences in jails. Councils need to go back to focusing on issues that affect their ratepayers, roads, rates and rubbish, and leave the grandstanding for others.
Yeah, and look, I've got to say all credit to Nick Rees. He's got a backbone on this issue because he would have come under huge pressure internally from the Labor left movement, the Greens movement and others to vote the other way, but he stood firm. Just quickly, James, a win of sorts for the taxpayer today because the ABC has severed ties with RMIT's fact-checking operation. Now, I've got a personal stake in this one. This was the mob that suspended my expose on the Uluru Statement last year. It was taken off Facebook. They tried to fact-check me. They got it wrong. over the 26 pages of the Uluru Statement. So this is good news, but it's cost taxpayers close to $700,000, to $750 million that they've wasted on this mob.
Yeah, look, fine, I'm glad they've broken up with them, but, you know, the problem is Facebook is still using this mob, and ABC says they're going to wind up doing their own internal kind of fact-checking thing, which, again, as you know, is going to be exactly the same sort of thing. They sort of push on, you know, misinformation and disinformation, which means, Peta, things we don't like and we don't want people to hear. Heading into elections, you know, Facebook in the U.S., the ABC here, it's very scary stuff when you have these sort of black boxes deciding what you are and are not allowed to hear and what is and isn't the truth, instead of letting people make up their own minds, which I think in a democracy we should be allowed to do.
I tell you, if Sky wants to set up a fact-checking unit here and we'll go against the ABC, I know I've got a media show, but I'll happily put in the extra hours and take on the ABC. Thank you both, James and Caroline. All right, let's go now to that naval announcement from yesterday. $11 billion in funding said the headlines. But in reality, as I said to you last night, we've only actually got $1.7 billion in real terms in the budget. And has sadly become standard operating practice for defence, most of the procurements are on the never-never. Now, as an example, yesterday we got told there's new mini frigates on the way, said the Minister. But if you look at the fine print, you'll find out that we haven't actually chosen the design or from what country we're going to buy them. Now that the dust is all settled, I spoke with the Australian's foreign editor Greg Sheridan a little earlier, who hasn't held back, referring to the announcement as, quote, a cross between a damp squib and a huge con job.
Yeah, Peter, I mean, this is a really pathetic announcement from the government. The only thing we know for sure is that they're going to take 2 Anzac frigates out of service. So they're going to reduce the Anzacs from 9 to 7, which will, and that'll give us a surface fleet of about, from 8 to 6. So that'll give us a surface fleet of 9 in the short term. That's what they can actually do. Now, they're promising, you know, on Star Trek time to create 20 surface combatants, but most of these are going to be so-called Tier 2 ultra-light frigates. And now the Tier 2 frigates are only supposed to have twice the number of vertical launch cells that the Anzacs have, which the Anzacs have 8. The Tier 2 frigates will have 16. We regard the Hunter frigate at having 32 as being wildly underarmed. So these are very, very, very little pop-gun boats that we're going to get. And Peter, I'd take our viewers back to Kevin Rudd's Defence White Paper in 2009. It said we must have 12 regionally superior submarines as soon as possible. And all around Asia for the first year or so after that, the Rudd and Gillard governments were saying, look, we're going to double Australia's submarine fleet. Isn't that fantastic? So the government got what it wanted, which was a whole bunch of headlines, but we got no submarines. And here we are 15 years later, we still got the same 6 old Collins-class submarines and no new submarine, you know, in prospect even.
I've got to ask you a question, though. I mean, here we have on paper this idea that we are going to buy off the shelf, and that's our best chance of getting this stuff in the water as quick as possible. But I think I went back last night and said it was the 1960s. That was the last time we truly bought off the shelf. How confident are you that the government will meet that commitment and the defence bureaucracy won't get them to make it special and do something extra that blows out time and budget? But secondly, you and I have been around long enough, right? Defence industry, defence bureaucrats have been giving advice to government, and then 4 or 5 years later, the government, having taken that advice, has to come out and say, well, wrong decision, won't work, we're now told it's something else. And this happens all the time, regardless of who's in power. So when are there going to be heads roll in the defence machine for all these wrong-headed sets of advices that go to government, all these reviews that go nowhere, that recommend this and we end up with that, then we're told that that's wrong, we should have had this. Who is going to take responsibility in the defence bureaucracy for getting this so wrong so often?
Well, you're absolutely right, Peter. Miles's first big mistake. Anthony Albanese and Richard Miles made very good speeches on defence and opposition. They seem to have a good understanding of the problem. Miles's first big mistake was to reappoint all the senior defence and civilian leaders in the defence establishment. So if you want a change of cultural direction, you don't do that by reappointing everybody who has given you this terrible performance over the years. I slightly exempt industry from the criticism because it is government and the Defence Department which keeps changing the requirements. So Lursen is building our offshore patrol vessels. Lursen is a perfectly competent shipbuilding company, but they've been underway for 6 years, longer than the time of the Second World War. And this, the simplest ship we're building, has still not come into service. But that's because they get endless repeated changes of requirements from the government and the defence establishment. I mean, industry has a legitimate gripe in Australia that they never get a straight order. Now, you asked, how confident am I we're really going to buy off the shelf? I think there's no chance of that at all. No chance of that at all. So again, to take the Lursen's example, they're making the offshore patrol vessels. You could say, okay, finish that at 6, which the government has done, and build for us instead the same corvettes that you build for other countries. Lursen already builds them. We know how many missile cells they've got, how many helicopters they can launch, all the rest of it. Instead, for reasons that are unfathomable, we're going to have a tender process, a design competition. We're allegedly going to look for a mature design. But Defence claimed it was going for a mature design when it went for the Hunter frigate. If we're urgent and we want to move now, why not just buy from the South Koreans or the Americans as soon as they can build them, an Arleigh Burke or a big guided missile destroyer like the Koreans build for themselves? The fact that we're going, and you see, it suits the government in a way because we have the competition next year, we make a decision in 2025. That means they don't have to spend any real money in the forward estimates, which means really they're just having a lend of us. They're just pulling our legs. This is complete baloney, this statement. It's as likely to come into existence as Kevin Rudd's 12 regionally superior conventional submarines. It's almost completely meaningless. And once again, Miles has failed to give either money or leadership or purpose or definition to our defence efforts.
Greg Sheridan, we as Australians are indebted to you for keeping a focus on this stuff, but unravelling all the defence speak here, because you are keeping them honest. Thank you for your time as always.
Thanks so much, Peta. Great to be with you.
All right, after the break, even Joe Biden's realised his electric vehicle goals are simply unachievable. So what will it take for Chris Bowen to back down before Australians are paying thousands more for our cars? Plus, worrying developments with euthanasia, a sense that we're going to move away now from terminal illnesses to look at allowing medical suicide for mental health issues. Surely we can support people better rather than give them drugs to end their life. Welcome back. Can't find an ATM? Don't worry, you're not alone. Statistics show they're disappearing almost as fast as cash is. Plus, do we really want to allow euthanasia for simple depression? Well, that's on the cards in the NT, and Kel Richards, as always, on a Wednesday. But first, with each passing day, Chris Bowen's fuel efficiency standard is looking more like a tax on the vehicles that we want to drive. Many of Australia's favourite vehicles could soon be hit by Bowen's new standards, with data this week showing just how much some models could go up. And it gets worse for Bowen, with the news that even Joe Biden could be winding back EV mandates in the United States. For more on this now, I'm joined by Shadow Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Ted O'Brien. Ted, I think what staggers Australians is we're already pinched. We're already feeling cost of living. We get this mandate come out, Bowen's breakneck speed to get these electric vehicles into the market, but he's punishing us because some of these cars, a Land Cruiser, for example, up by $25,000. They're expensive anyway. How can we afford this?
Well, Peter, we can't. And today I went to a Toyota dealership in Western Sydney, actually Chris Bowen's electorate.
Yep.
And in speaking with people there, you're right, the Land Cruiser, $25,000 that'll go up. The Hilux, $15,000. This is an outright tax. So mums and dads can't afford it.
No.
They can't afford to drive the cars they love. Tradies, they can't afford to buy the cars they need. And when you talk to the dealers themselves, they are worried that Australia's most favourite vehicles might actually be pulled off the Australian market just so that the manufacturers can meet Chris Bowen's targets. So, look, it's a big tax. He calls it a fuel efficiency scheme or standard, but really it's a tax.
Because he's basically making a cap per manufacturer Am I
based on
right?
it. Correct.
Yeah, and if they go outside the cap, that's when these big price penalties hit.
Exactly. So they say to a manufacturer, you need to reduce emissions by 60% across your entire fleet on average over a 5-year period. And so what happens, they say, well, if you look at Australia's most favourite ones, so, the Ranger, the Hilux, the D-Max, our 3 most favourite vehicles go above the threshold required. So what happens? You boost the price of those up, so you sell fewer of them, and you bring the price down of EVs to sell more of them. So you are restricting choice for consumers.
It's tough if you're a regional person, though, because
Really
you
tough.
have to have some of those vehicles, not by choice, but because of your geography or the job you do. And also, our market in Australia, given we're, right-hand drive, is quite small.
Yeah, very small, completely different. And this is where I think Labor just has a tin ear on this stuff. People who want EVs should be given the right to purchase EVs. But if you don't want one, or your lifestyle can't afford it, then you need to have other choices. You can't, this is again a case of Labor just being big government, saying we will decide what cars you must drive, just as they are saying we will decide what form of energy you must use.
So talk to me about the US, because, I watch what's happening in Europe. They're starting to wind things back or put things on pause. There's all this talk that we won't actually go down the path of mass EVs. We could go down the path of hydrogen or any number of technologies that are still not yet firmed up. But what's happening in the United States that Bowen's so out of step with now?
So Bowen said he was basing this efficiency standard on the US, but now we have President Biden basically pulling up the handbrake on his efficiency standards. Why? Because sales of EVs are going down, they don't have the infrastructure in place, and consumers in the US are pushing back saying, we can't afford this. But Chris Bowen, instead of displaying humility, he's displaying hubris. He's not pulling up the brake. No, he's putting his foot on the pedal and saying, let's just go harder.
I have to say, just on EVs, I'll go to something else, but I do not want to be a woman at 11 o'clock at night in the middle of a country highway, standing there waiting, an hour, hour and a half, if there's a charger available and it's operable, for my car to charge. I want to fill up and go and feel secure and get on the road. Just talk to me, though, regional renewable issues and a backlash from communities. Last year, it was happening in pockets where there are big developments coming. I'm flooded with people on email. I'm sure you are too. It's right across the board. And communities, they don't just want the eyesore, sure. They're worried about the remediation when the solar farm doesn't work anymore. It's lucky to get a 20-year life. They're worried that they're being taken for granted, run roughshod over. They're worried about farmers, and they're not seeing people in the cities pull their weight with this renewables rollout. Is that fair?
Peter, it's not fair, and you're right that it's getting worse. And so, but here's the thing, we're just at the beginning of this. If you look at Labor's plan, this will get worse and worse, and I think it's going to get ugly. Because what Labor is doing, they're going to regional communities. And I've been there, I've been on the ground, I've held forums, I've done all that stuff. And we're not talking about regional people who are saying, I hate this particular technology. These are just people who are proud of their way of life. They love the forest, they love the animals, the habitat, the environment, the ocean. And basically they have a government that is displaying reckless indifference towards their way of life. And they're Australians. And you know what it's like? You push Australians against the wall, and my God, do you see a pushback? And that is what is happening in regional Australia, because they are not being listened to. Labor have targets they've set, and they're falling short, and instinctively they are getting desperate and just ploughing ahead and steamrolling over people.
Ted O'Brien, thank you. And
thank you, Peter.
I get feedback saying that you're terrific on the ground when you go to these community forums. People feel like they're being heard, so well done on that as well.
Appreciate it.
All right, let's go now to my panel. Lots of other issues I want to get across. Shadow Environment Minister John O'Donoghue, Senator for Tasmania, of course, and Senior Fellow at the Menzies Research Centre, columnist too with The Australian, Nick Cater. Well, gents, I'll start with you, Nick, if I can. It's a difficult issue. People have very strong views on euthanasia. But in the Northern Territory, the government is surveying residents, asking people if they want to move beyond just the terminal ill requirements to access the drugs. They're saying, how about we make it open to people that are suffering from mental illness? Now, I say Can't we do more for people with mental health concerns rather than just hand them over suicide drugs?
I think that's the thing. This is really they talk about the slippery slope, Peter, and this is the slippery slope. You know, first it was going to be for terminally ill people, and then that definition gets narrowed down. I just don't see how, with mental illness in particular, particularly severe mental illness, you can really judge this notion of consent. I mean, I've had this in my family, a family member who had Alzheimer's, and you know, when people get that kind of condition, the idea of consent just goes out of the window, and so euthanasia can easily become a very convenient way to get rid of a relative who's just taking up space. I really think that we have to draw a halt at this point, have a look at the conditions under which we allow euthanasia, and really review this before it goes any further. I'm desperately concerned about it, Peter. You know, this is what we feared would happen from the start.
And also Senator Dunham, of course, a lot of these schemes in states now are really pretty embryonic. They've only been operating, I think the longest is just on a 2-year period. We've seen a case in Queensland, for example. There's a coronial inquest because a grieving husband used the wife's drugs to kill himself. After she passed away, she had the drugs, she'd been ticked off for euthanasia. She ended up dying naturally. The drugs were in the home though, and he took them because he was inconsolable about her death. Now, I thought we were supposed to have safeguards in place to stop this happening. What if it had been a case of a young child accessing the drugs in a home? I mean, this is a real worry.
It absolutely is. I'm an opponent of euthanasia, and I know that isn't going to be something accepted by everyone, but you cannot legislate and regulate away every risk associated with this. This is one of those unintended consequences that people, lawmakers, were warned about when states and territories went to legislate. Nick referred to them before, and you raise a great example. What if a kid came across these fatal substances in the home? This is what you can't protect the community from, and I don't think no matter how hard you try, you're going to be able to stop these risks from being present, and we cannot protect the community from the harm that comes from it. So the horse has bolted, sadly. These schemes are in place. I hope lessons are learned out of what happened in Queensland, a heartbreaking story, but it does rather prove the point that people were warned about all along when these laws were being drafted in the first place.
Nick, let's go to the issue of the NHMRC, our peak medical body, going out there with the government support, I might add, backed in by Mark Butler, the Health Minister, to not only give us advice on nutrition. So, you know, you pick up something off the supermarket shelf, there's a table on the back, you go through protein, carbs, all that sort of stuff. There'll now be a line, presumably, that says climate impact. You know, choose this over that. I shouldn't laugh because this is seriously what they're looking at.
Yeah, look, I mean, the whole public health sector, Peter, has suffered a great decline in the amount of trust people have in them during COVID because, you know, we know now that so much of what they pushed as the scientific truth, the latest evidence, turned out to be absolute tosh, to be quite frank about it. And this is too. Look, they've stepped outside their lane. They're not there to deal with climate change or sustainability. They are there to deal with people's health, what makes individuals like you and I better. I don't trust their advice at all, but on this, it's complete misinformation. It's complete nonsense science. I mean, the fact is in a country like Australia that grass-fed cattle and sheep contribute to a cycle which actually enrich the soil. And this idea that we're using too much land for grazing, well, you know better than most from where you come from, Peter, that a lot of Australia is covered with land that is grazed with sheep and cattle for the sole reason that that's all it's good for. You can't actually grow anything.
It's very marginal.
So
you're spot
I would
on.
like to see, I would like to see them put up the arguments as to why we shouldn't have extremely nutritious food like red meat.
Let's go to the issue of cash becoming a bit of an endangered subsidy. I was going to say species, but it's not a species. Jonathan Dunham, you know, I thought it was legal tender. Well, we saw Bob Catter go to the cafeteria and not be able to use cash the other day until he, you know, made it a national story and got his way. But if you look at the data about ATMs, we've lost about half the ATMs around Australia since 2017. I mean, what's happening here?
It is probably, frankly, cost-cutting measures on the part of banks, which I find disappointing. I think these organisations that make significant profits, I believe, should be required to maintain these facilities in regional communities. I've got nothing against profits, but delivering on these services to communities is critically important. But this reliance on electronic transactions, EFTPOS, I think is very dangerous. Not so long ago, we had telecommunications network outages, and I remember going to buy a coffee. Now, I'm one of these lazy people that doesn't go to the ATM, not because I don't believe in cash, but because it's convenient for me. I went down, I couldn't purchase a coffee because their payment system wasn't working. So what do we do if we don't have ATMs, if people aren't using cash, if shops won't accept cash? We're going to be a bit stuck. So I hope that out of some of these incidents that have occurred, particularly for older Australians who don't like to use electronic transactions, we stick to it. And I hope the big banks, particularly with their fee-free ATMs, revert to using them. They've closed the branches. ATMs are a much cheaper alternative. Please keep them, particularly in regional communities, but as well in big cities too.
Or down the track, the bank decides it doesn't like you and it shuts down your account. You think I'm joking? Talk to Nigel Farage. Jono and Nick, thank you. Great to have you as always. Let's quick break now though. Let's come back with Kel Richards. Welcome back. Well, I'm pleased to say not only is he joining me here on a Wednesday, we are in situ. My good friend, wordsmith and broadcaster Kel Richards. Well, lovely to be with you. Lorraine, one of our viewers, asked a question about if a French person or a lover of all things French is a francophile, what do you call someone who loves Australia or Australian things?
Well, there's also Anglophile, someone who likes England and all things English.
Yes.
But there is no word for someone who likes Australia and all things Australian. So I've coined one. So just for you, this is a first time. This is
exclusive here on
exclusive breaking word. I think it's a good idea to have a word for that. So how about Austrophile?
Austrophile, yes.
It does the same thing as Francophile and Anglophile. It's a bit of Latin and a bit of Greek, so it's a bit dodgy in that sense, but they're both a bit of Latin and a bit of Greek. It comes from the Latin for southern and phile from Greek for lover. And we need to be able to say those people who love this country, love gum trees and the sound of didgeridoos and the things that make us Australian, all our values. Because there are other people who are the opposite, who are austrophobes. Haters of...
Now, is that one real? Have you created
No,
that
I've
one
made
as
that
well?
up too, I'm sorry.
Astrophobes, I love it, I love it, I love it.
We need them as a pair of words. Those university students who don't want to fly the Australian flag and say we're all racists are austrophobes, but you and I are austrophiles. So there
I'm
you
going
are.
to use this. It's going to come into our nomenclature from here on.
Great.
I love it. I just say they're patriots and they're haters, but I think yours is much more eloquent. Much more eloquent. What about the term going rogue? One of our viewers, Matthew, says, what does it mean when we say going rogue?
Started off meaning behaving erratically, and it started in 1905 to apply only to elephants. So it was elephants that became dangerous, and they were said to be going rogue. So they were erratic and unpredictable.
Do we know why rogue was used?
Because of the way they behave. Well, a rogue is anyone who's an outlaw.
Right.
So this is an elephant you can't control. 1932 was applied to human beings, and it meant much this, but it meant particularly human beings who were not taking orders, who were not doing as they were told. This particular viewer who wrote to us talked about a public servant who was supposedly going rogue. I mean, you've been there.
They're always rogue, mate. They're always rogue.
That would never happen.
This is one where we were just having a chat off air, Kel and I. This is one I find fascinating. So fillet and valet. Now, if you're in America, it's a fillet of fish.
Yes, yes.
And that is a valet. I must confess, I think I used to say valet, never said fillet. I think I have said valet until I used to watch Downton Abbey. And I reckon if they call it valet in Downton Abbey, it must be valet.
And the Oxford says in Britain they use both valet and valet, so that one's dealt with.
What do you use? Do you use valet?
I say a valet because of Bertie Wooster and Jeeves.
Yeah.
Jeeves is valet. So
good.
We're on the same page. Fillet. When Americans call a fillet of beef a fillet, they are being semi-literate and advertising their ignorance, because what they're doing is, I don't want to be unkind to the Americans, who are nice people, but they're advertising the fact that they've worked out this word came into English from French, but it came into English from French 150 years ago, Peter. I think it's taken out its naturalisation papers and there's an established English pronunciation, so I'm sorry, any Americans watching, it's a fillet from now on. Try to get it right.
Just a quick one. Teaspoon, tablespoon. One of our viewers, Adam, says, well, I know what a teaspoon is. I use it for tea. Where does tablespoon come from?
Until about 1700, everyone carried their own spoon.
Oh.
There was no cutlery on the table. Like we carry a wallet or car keys, you carried your own spoon.
Oh.
And then about 1700, someone invented the place setting. So you arrived and there was the cutlery. It was called a tablespoon because it was on the table waiting for you.
There you go. There you go. I think it's fascinating too in some countries, like the spoons around one way, the forks.
Oh, yes.
All right, great to see you, Kel.
See you next time.
All right, that's it for me. Andrew Bolt's up next, but I'll be back tomorrow night at 6.